For this first week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about dietary guidelines and digestion, and we'll try to break that down into about 10 to 20 minute segments of clips, so that's not too much for you all at once. There also is a discussion assignment that's posted and available. Just go to the Dropbox, or I'm sorry, go to the assessment section and then go down to discussions, and all the instructions for it will be available there. What you'll do is you'll answer the question, and then once you do, you'll have access to the other students' posts. And you'll comment, just providing some type of feedback on 2 of the other students' posts in the class once you've posted your own discussion initially. Your discussion is going to be due this Friday at midnight, and then your 2 responses, those will be due by this next Wednesday. Take a look at what you have right here. This is the food guide pyramid. What I would like for you to do is to do a little bit of an assignment. This won't be graded, but it will just take a couple minutes and kind of get you familiar with some of the dietary guidelines. Go ahead, based on this model and breakdown, review each of the food groups, and then put together a meal that is consistent with this model. So go ahead and pause this video. Take just about a minute or 2 to go through this, and then put together a meal that looks like this or follows this model. Okay, by now you should have something down. Go ahead and do that exact same thing with the model that you have on this screen. Take just a couple minutes, put together a meal that is consistent with this outline here. So take another minute to reflect. What was the difference between the meals that you put together, number 1, and then number 2, did you find that using one of those models was more practical or easier to put together a meal with than another? What you're looking at there are some of the older sets of the dietary guidelines with the pyramid, and then the most recent dietary guidelines that have been around for the past 5 to 10 years with the plate model that you saw in that second slide. For the dietary guidelines, we can break those down into 3 separate groups. We have 1, the dietary reference intakes, 2, acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, and 3, we have the food guides. So for the DRIs, or the dietary reference intakes, there's a few different types of each of those, but what we can do with the DRIs is look up specific nutrients and determine how much of those nutrients a certain age group should be getting. The acceptable macronutrient distribution range, this provides a little bit more specifics about a balanced diet. It gives us the approximate amounts or the proportions of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that we should get. And then my plate, or the food guide, these provide a practical tool for us to use in order to put together meals. If you're trying to put together a dietary plan, you can do so using any of these models, and if done correctly, it's probably going to result in a very healthy way of eating. But using my plate would be like putting together an eating plan by following a 3-minute YouTube video. The AMDRs, that would be like putting together a meal plan with a 50-page instruction manual, and the dietary reference intakes are probably a little bit more complicated with that. If you use those to put together a meal plan, that would be like using a full-blown book or a 100 or 150-page instruction manual. So my plate is the most practical, simplest to use. AMDR is a little bit more complex. DRIs give very specific information, but it still is pretty complex and pretty complicated to use. If you go into the learning activities for this chapter, what you'll find is a link that provides a brief history of what has gone on for the food guides, what changes have been made over the years. So we started out with a model in the early 1900s, and today we've evolved into MyPlate. You're probably familiar with the food pyramid, which you can see that started in 1982, and then MyPlate, which started in 2010. The less are not quite as well known, but all of these have constituted food guides for the United States over the past 100 or so years. Take into consideration some of the things that we've just gone over, especially when you consider the food guides, and specifically with the food guides, MyPlate. How would you rate this person's intake? So for breakfast, they had oatmeal with honey, apple toast with butter, orange juice. For lunch, baked sweet potato, grapes and berries, milk, raisins. For dinner, whole wheat pasta with veggies and tomato sauce, cornbread, side salad, beets, and carrots. So again, go back to what we have for MyPlate and then rate this person's intake. If you need a little bit of time to finish that assignment, go ahead and stop this now. Pause it. You can come back to this. Take a couple minutes to just go over that. Alright, so the second part of this chapter is going to focus on the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges and the dietary reference intakes. To clarify, for the DRIs and the AMDRs, both of these are going to be looking at more so specific nutrients and less at the bigger picture. So we're kind of honing in with each of these things. DRIs a little bit more so than AMDRs. And that's because, again, DRIs, those are going to focus on micronutrients and macronutrients. AMDRs, acceptable macronutrient distribution range, we're just going to be focusing on the macronutrients. So macronutrients, we're just talking about carbohydrates, proteins, and fat, and this gives us an idea of about how much of each of those, the proportion of our total calories that we should be getting from these AMDRs. So for adults, about 45 to 65% of our calories should come from carbohydrates, 10 to 35% of our calories should come from protein, and then 20 to 35% of these calories should come from fat. Again, we've talked about macronutrients a couple times now. Those are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And so there are macronutrients and there are micronutrients. For macronutrients, think of macro versus micro. Macro large, micro small. Now that doesn't mean that one is more important than the other, but it does mean that we need more of the macronutrients than we do of the micronutrients. So the macronutrients, we need those in larger quantities. Micronutrients, we need those in smaller quantities. And again, the macros, that's carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And you can kind of get a sense of how much more we need of these macros than we do of the micros just by looking at a food label. If you take a food label and look at the back of it, what you'll see is that carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, those are all listed in grams. And then if you can find sodium and potassium, those are two micronutrients. And micronutrients that we need in larger amounts for that matter, those are listed in milligrams. So for every 1,000 milligrams, you have 1 gram. So micronutrients, we need those in smaller amounts, macros in larger. And the AMDRs, they are guidelines specific to these macros, and they focus more on proportion and also more on dietary balance of these macronutrients. For macros, again, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, there's lots of roles for each of these, but we're going to go over at least the main functions of these different nutrients. Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are all going to provide us with energy, although they're all going to be different types of energy. It's important to note that proteins are going to give us energy, but the energy that they give us, it's not that effective. And it requires quite a sacrifice in order for us to get energy from proteins. So carbohydrates and fats, those are going to give us energy. Different types of energy between carbs and fats, but they're going to give us energy nonetheless. Carbohydrates are going to spare the breakdown of protein and fat, and they also help to produce RNA and DNA, which is essential for our own cells and their division. Fats, again, they give us energy. They allow our body to utilize certain vitamins, mainly A, D, E, and K. They help to protect and insulate and keep warm our organs, and intake of essential fatty acids helps to reduce inflammation. Proteins are responsible for tissue structure and muscle structure. They're also used as enzymes for chemical reactions, and they promote optimal hormonal function. From the last slide, you get a sense of what the functions of those different nutrients are. And this slide specifically highlights why that balance that you get with the AMDRs is so important, because it talks about what happens if you get an excess intake of each of these or an inadequate intake of each of them. So for carbohydrates, too high intake of carbs, that causes an increase in fat storage and can also lead to a hormonal imbalance. Inadequate carbohydrates is going to cause inadequate levels of energy and inefficient fueling, especially for higher intensity physical activity. Excess intake of fats, same problem with carbohydrates, it's more likely to cause excess fat storage. Inadequate amounts can lead to difficulty concentrating, decreased mood, poor hair and skin health, and those are mainly the deficiencies. Problems with fat are mainly linked to an inadequate absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins and also the hormonal imbalance that's caused by inadequate fat intakes. For protein, too much causes us to store more body fat, and an inadequate amount of protein causes muscle breakdown. What we're going to do over the next few slides is quickly address some of the different dietary reference intakes. The first one we'll talk about is the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance, and this is the amount of a nutrient that is going to meet the vast majority of the general healthy population's needs. And we're going to have RDAs for most nutrients. So we have this for protein, carbohydrates, and fats. Most of the vitamins, of the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, and E, vitamin C, all of the B vitamins, and then a good chunk of the minerals. So what this means is that we have a lot of information to be able to pinpoint this amount. So there's a lot of studies that have been done, a lot is known about these nutrients. We have very precise research, so we can tell specifically that an intake, if we get the RDA for our age group for each of those nutrients, there's a very, very, very good chance, about a 97 to 98% chance, that that amount will meet our needs. For the dietary reference intakes, you have a few different types of values. You have the recommended dietary allowance, tolerable upper limit, estimated average requirement, and adequate intake. So there's going to be different values that are used for different nutrients. If a nutrient has an RDA, it's also going to have an EAR, but if there's not enough information available about a nutrient, then it's going to have an adequate intake. And then the tolerable upper level is going to be the amount that if you exceed intake of that amount for that nutrient, then you are at risk for a toxicity or an excess intake and the associated problems from that nutrient. Let's use this as a segue into the dietary reference intakes. Iron is a major component of your hemoglobin. Having enough iron is going to allow adequate oxygen transport throughout the body. So suppose you are an athlete and you want to be sure that you do not get anemia, which is actually quite common for people who are physically active and presents itself via chronic fatigue. So you can take a look at the DRI for iron, and you can figure out which foods have certain amounts of iron and then incorporate those into your diet, starting on this next slide. Say you have a history of a deficiency in iron, or for some reason you're at risk for having an iron deficiency. You can use the dietary reference intakes in order to determine how much food with iron you need to get in order to make sure that you're meeting your needs. So for example, if you are a female between the age of 19 and 30, what you would do is look up the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA, which is a subgroup of the DRIs, and you would find that you need about 18 milligrams of iron per day. If you're a male in that age group, you need about 8. And then what you could do, if you want to get a specific amount in, you could go over to a list of iron-rich foods that you can see on the right side of the screen, and then you could make sure that you're getting, if you're women, 18 milligrams, or if you're men, 8 milligrams. Now, that's probably not going to be necessary in the vast majority of cases. If you are at risk for iron deficiency, your best bet is probably just to make sure you eat lots of foods from that list on the right side of the screen. But if it's something that is very prominent and prevalent, then it may be something worth doing. And this is where something like the dietary reference intakes can be very useful, because it tells you an exact amount, approximately, that you should be getting. Tolerable upper limits, or the ULs for nutrients, is the amount that if you reach or exceed that intake of a nutrient, you are at risk for a toxicity or an adverse effect from having too much of that nutrient. Now, in order to do that, you generally have to have a very, very high intake of that nutrient. To reach the tolerable upper limit, you need to go way over the amount that you would approximately need in order to reach. And oftentimes, even if you exceed that amount, you are still unlikely to experience those adverse effects. However, excess supplement intake, especially with minerals and some of the fat-soluble vitamins, that can make a toxicity a little bit more likely. To get a vitamin A toxicity from food, it's very difficult to do. You probably wouldn't be able to do it even if you ate lots and lots and lots of carrots. However, if you ate polar bear liver, because a very large amount of vitamin A is stored in polar bear liver, then you might get toxicity, or the side effects of having too much of vitamin A. We have adequate intakes for nutrients that less research has been done on or less is known about. And so this is going to provide us with a wider range. So the adequate intakes, we're less certain about how much of these nutrients people should get. And the nutrients that would fall under this category that have adequate intakes for are potassium, manganese, choline, and vitamin K. We just simply do not know quite as much about how much a person should get. For example, low potassium generally only occurs in people with cardiac complications or fluid imbalances. So deficiencies are rare unless these types of things are going on. Something important to note about the dietary reference intakes is that these values are only for healthy people. Somebody that is an alcoholic is going to process a very large amount of thiamine or vitamin B1. So the recommended intake in order for them to have optimal health from thiamine is going to be very, very high. Also, for somebody who has chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, they break down protein a lot more easily, so their protein needs are going to be much higher. So the dietary reference intakes are only for healthy people, so an alcoholic would not be able to reference the DRIs to determine how much thiamine they should get, and again, somebody with COPD would not be able to reference this either to determine how much protein they need.